a user sign-up form here, which is rather long. There are a lot of fields, which can be quite intimidating to a user and might scare them away. Now, one option when you're faced with a long form is to turn it into a multi-step form or wizard. Probably the easiest way to make a wizard is using JavaScript. This way you can keep everything on the client side, so if you have a long form, you can just use some JavaScript to turn it into a multi-step form. Everything is still on the client side, and that way you don't have to change your Rails application at all. However, this isn't always the best option. You might need the data to be more persistent, where each step is stored in the Rails app, or you might want to make it more dynamic so the steps change depending on the Rails app and add validations and so on. So, if you need to manage a wizard through a Rails app, consider using the Wicked gem by Richard Schneeman. This adds some behavior to a Rails controller to allow you to turn it into a multi-step process. Let me show you how it works here. The first step is to go to your long form and to strip it down to as few fields as possible. A good rule of thumb is to only require the information necessary for the user to access the record in the future. In the case of a user sign-up form, that would be the authentication, so here is an email and password fields will need to stay. Everything else can go onto separate steps in our wizard. So here's what the view template looks like for that user sign-up form, and I'm just going to strip out all of the fields in here except for the email and password. And now reload the page, and so this simplified form will be our first step in the wizard. Now at this point, it's a good idea to ask yourself, do I really need a wizard? We could just have a separate edit profile page with those extra fields there. But I'm going to assume that a wizard is the best user experience for your situation and continue on. So let's add the Wicked gem to this application. In the bottom of my gem file, I'm just going to call gem Wicked, and you'll need to run the bundle command to install it. Next, I'm going to generate a new controller called user steps. This way we have a controller dedicated to managing the steps for the wizard. By the way, you can name this controller anything you want. Wicked doesn't really care. Next, I'll go inside of my routes file here and add a new resources line for that user steps controller we generated. And then I'll go inside that controller. And in here I'll add a new line to include the Wicked wizard module provided by the gem. And this gives us a steps method that we can use to define which other steps we want in the form process after the user is created. So what we want to do is add two steps in here for the rest of the form. One is for the personal information, and one is for the more social information, such as the GitHub handle, the Twitter username, and so on. Now this controller is expected to respond to the show action, where it should render out a given step of the wizard process. And there's a handy little method to help with this called render wizard, and this will look for a form view template for each step. So we'll need to create those views under the views user steps directory here. Let's make two files, one for personal.html.erb and one for the social step, social.html.erb. For now, I'm just going to add the words social and personal into here just so we can distinguish between these two views. So with all of this in place, we should be able to access any specific step through the URL by calling user steps/personal, and that will render out that personal template, and passing social in here will render out that template. So that's what the render wizard method does. It renders out the given template passed in here. And by the way, if we trigger the index action for this controller, it'll redirect us to the first step in the process, which is the personal step. So what we need to do is have the user's new action. When we submit this form, it directs us to the first step in the process. All right, so when that form gets submitted, it's going to trigger this user's controller create action I have set up, and this is going to save the user and log them in by remembering the user ID in a session. Now, when that happens, we want to redirect them to the first step in the wizard process, so we need to go to the user steps path from this controller. So that'll redirect us to the first step in the process. So now let's try this out. I filled in this sign up form, and let's submit this form, and this will redirect us to the first step in the wizard. So all we need to do here is add a form for submitting and going to the next step. Now if we want a form for editing the user on each render wizard step here, we're going to have to first fetch the user, and I'm going to do that inside of this controller and set it to an instance variable. And I already have a method set up called current user, and normally you will if you have some kind of user authentication set up. But if you don't have this, what you can do is just pass in the object's ID when you redirect to the steps controller. So now going to the personal template, I can replace this with a call to form4 so that we can edit that user record. Now I do need to pass in a URL option to this because normally it'll go to the user's controller, and I need it to go to the user steps controller. And I can pass a wizard path helper method to this, which will go to the proper action. And let's pass this in here and end the form. Now I'm just going to paste in the content for this form because it's basically the same fields that I deleted from the other form, and then I just have a submit button that says continue down below. So now when I reload this personal page, it now has the form for editing the personal fields. Now when I click on continue here, it's going to trigger the update action for that user steps controller, and I haven't created that yet. So going to the controller, I need to make that update action, which will work very similar to the show action, where it fetches the current user, but I need to set the attributes based off of the form. So I can say user attributes and set them based off of the user parameters which are submitted through the form. And then one other difference is that I pass in the user object to this render wizard call. Now when you pass in a resource like this, it's going to attempt to call save on this object, and then if that succeeds, it's going to go on to the next step. But if it fails, it's going to render the current step again. So now let's try this out. When we click on continue here, it's going to trigger that update action, which will bring us to the next step because the user model saved successfully. So I'll do basically the same thing for the social template. I'll paste in the content for this form, and again go into the wizard path, and it just has the social related fields. So now reloading this page shows us that form with those fields, and submitting this is going to trigger that update action again, and since there aren't any further steps, it's just going to redirect to the root of this application, which just shows that I'm logged in. Now if you want to change that redirect behavior, you can override a method in the controller called redirect to finish wizard, and then handle the redirect however you want. So I'll go to the root URL again, but this time I'm going to pass in a notice option and saying, thank you for signing up. That way we get a little message. The next thing I want to add to this wizard form is a link next to the continue button to skip this step so that the user knows this information isn't required. Now if you check out the README, you can find a handy list of methods that Wicked provides, and among this is next wizard path, which will give us a URL to the next step so we can make a skip link. So going to the view template for a step, I'll add a link next to this continue button that says skip this step, and then pass in the next wizard path that Wicked provides. And I'll do the same thing in the other step as well, so it shows up on both. So now I have a link to skip this step so that it's more clear that the step is optional. Next, let's talk about validations. For example, let's say I want to validate the format of this Twitter username so someone can't add spaces and so on. First of all, I'm currently not displaying any validation error messages on each step, so I'm going to paste in some error display code that is pretty standard on a form. You'll probably want to move this into some kind of helper method or partial to help remove the duplication across the forms. And now I can just go into my user model and add a validation. So I'll run validates format of on here and pass in my Twitter username attribute, and let's say without a non-word character like that. And the important option to pass in here is allow blank and set that to true. So that way this is an optional parameter. It isn't required to be present. So now when I try to submit this form with an invalid Twitter name, I get a validation error like I expect. Now the big question is, what if I want to validate the presence of a field? So I want to require that a Twitter username is present. Right now I can just continue and submit this form and it creates it successfully. Well, this is where things get a little tricky because when the first step here gets completed, the user record needs to be saved. So we can easily validate the presence of any of these fields on the first step, but if we try to validate the presence of the other fields in later steps, then the record will be invalid on the first step and we'll get validation warnings that don't apply to these fields. So going back to the user model, if we wanted to validate the presence of the Twitter username attribute, we would need to make this validation conditional. So we could add an if option here and define a method called on the social step. So this way we can check which step we're currently on, maybe set an attribute from the controller, and make this validation conditional based off of that. Now I won't be going into this fully here. Now if you need to do this, I recommend you check out the Wicked Wiki, because this has an article there explaining exactly this situation. Basically you need to turn the model into some kind of state machine to keep track of the progress and to make the validations conditional based off of the current status. For an alternative solution to this problem, check out episode 217, where I show you how to build a multi-step form from scratch. Now so far this wizard is pretty much complete, but we've left a lot of duplication between the different steps. You can see the personal template and the social template are nearly identical except for the fields and headline. Everything else is the same. Now this is a perfect case for a partial layout. Let me show you how it works here. First I'll do a little rearranging here to move the title at the top, and I'm going to extract all of this out here into a partial called form. Now instead of rendering this as a partial, I'm going to render it as a layout instead. And you can pass in a block to this and pass in any arguments you want. So I'm going to pass the form builder through this layout. And this means I can move everything I want into that partial layout. So I'll go into there and I can call yield inside of here and pass in the form builder as an argument into that block and add my action buttons at the end there. So that's all we need to do to make this layout form, and we can do the exact same thing inside of the social template as well. And there we go. Here I'm doing the same thing where I'm rendering that form partial as a layout and passing in the fields as a block. So now everything still works just like it did before. The form renders fine, and now there's no duplication across the different steps. Well, that's it for this episode on Wicked. Next time you need to make a wizard form with Rails, give it a try. It might do just what you need. In this week's Pro episode, I will show you how to deploy a Rails application to Amazon EC2 using the Rubber Gem. With that, you can set up a whole cluster with just a few commands, and it includes some awesome web tools to help monitor the cluster as well. To watch that episode and all other Pro and Revised episodes, just head on over to railscast.com/pro and then sign up there for just $9 per month. In episode 342, I showed you how to set up a Rails application with the Postgres database. Now, one thing I love about Postgres is that it can take on the responsibility of other things which often require a background process, such as managing a job queue. Now here I have a Rails application which is already set up with Postgres, and this application is designed to send out newsletters, and I can choose to deliver a newsletter by clicking on this link. Now this takes a while to process. You can see our application hasn't responded yet, and during this time the Rails instance will be unable to process other requests. So it's a good idea to move long-running tasks into the background process whenever possible. You can see I finally got the response here. It said it delivered and shows the status here. Here I'm going to solve this problem using the QClassic gem. This makes it easy to take a long-running task like this and move it into a background process which is managed using Postgres. Now, I'm going to be demonstrating version 2 here, which is currently on release candidate 12. Hopefully a final release will be out shortly. Now, this README provides some instructions on setting it up in a Rails application, so I'll follow that roughly here to set this up. First, I'll go into the gem file for this application, and at the bottom here, I'll add the QClassic gem. And then I'll need to specify the version, which is 2.0.RC12. Now, it is important to specify the version number here because it is a pre-release. So now just run the bundle command to install the gem. Next, I'm going to load in the rake tasks by going under my lib directory, and under the tasks directory here, I'll make a new file called qclassic.rake, and then paste in these two lines like it shows in the README. And then going into the config directory, I'll make a new initializer here called qclassic.rb. So this is where we can specify the QClassic configuration, which is done through environment variables like this. So that way it's fully compatible with Heroku. Now I'm just going to adjust this to fit this application. I don't need to specify the username and password here on my local system, but I do need to specify the database name, which is mailer underscore development here. Now you might want to move this into some kind of external configuration so you can easily adjust it for different environments. Next, we need to create a migration to set up the database. Now the README shows this all happening in a single migration file, but I found it necessary to split this up into two separate migrations because of the way transactions work. So I'll generate two migrations here, one called add QClassic, and then another called setup QClassic, like this. Now in the first migration, I'm going to paste in this code, which creates the job queue table and adds an index. And then in the second migration, I'll paste in this code to load in the QClassic functions. And now we can run rakedb migrate to run those migrations. And it looks like it worked. And then next, I'll start up the background worker process by calling rake qc work. Now if all goes well, I shouldn't see any output here. Now I'm going to experiment with this in another tab in the Rails console. Now to add a job to the queue, call qc.enqueue, and then you can pass in the method call you want to trigger, such as puts, and then whatever arguments you want to pass into this method call after this. So let's say hello world here to pass that in, and then added that to the queue, and on the left side, it printed it out here. Now what's going on behind the scenes here is that when we call enqueue, it's going to serialize these arguments into JSON format and then pass it to the queues table, which is then processed by the worker. Now, the JSON format serialization is pretty picky, and it's important to keep the arguments you're passing in here as simple as possible. It doesn't even like symbols, so if we pass in a symbol into here, maybe a hash, it's going to raise an exception. So it's important to always use strings instead, so I could say message as a string hash, and that will work and properly print it out on the queue. And there it is, there's our hash printed out. So just be careful on what arguments you pass in to that enqueue method. Alright, so let's go back to this application and make it so when we click on Deliver Newsletter, that long process happens in the background. Now when that link is clicked, it's going to trigger this deliver action in the newsletter's controller. And so this will just fetch that given newsletter, and then sleep for 10 seconds to simulate a long newsletter delivery, and then update that delivered at attribute with the current time so that it shows that it's delivered. Now whenever I have a long-running task like this in the controller, I like to move it into the model and a class method to simplify the interface as much as possible. So in this case, I'm going to make a class method on the newsletter model called deliver, and then just pass that ID into it. So now I just need to go into that newsletter model and define a class method in here called deliver and have it take that ID parameter. And I'll just paste in the code I had in the controller and have this use that ID parameter passed in. And I no longer need to call this on the newsletter class because I'm in that class at the moment. And that's it. All right, now that this is moved into a class method on the model, it's very easy to move this off into our background process by calling qc.enqueue and then just passing newsletter.deliver in as the method we want to call, and then passing our parameter ID into it. So now we just want to say delivering newsletter instead of saying that it's already delivered. So let's try this out. Now when I click on deliver newsletter, I get the response back instantly, but the newsletter is not yet delivered because it's processing in the background. So I'll just wait a little while and then hit reload here. And now it shows that the newsletter has been delivered. It works. Now what happens when a job fails and an exception gets raised while it is processing? Well, I'll add an exception here and try it out. Now when I click on deliver newsletter, it says it's delivering, but it's going to hit an exception when it tries to process it in the background worker. And then if I check out the worker process, you can see the failure is mentioned there, so be sure to log this output when you're using the worker in production. Now by default, QClassic doesn't try to do anything fancy such as automatically retry the job. If you check out the worker class in the source code, you can see there's a method in here called handleFailure, and which is just printing out that output. But it expects you to override this if you want to handle failure in another way. And if you check out the README, an example is shown here how you can subclass a worker and handle the failure differently. Now there's a lot of other great information in this README, such as an example on how to set up a worker executable file instead of using the rake task. So the advantage of this is that you can control exactly what gets loaded, so if you don't need your entire Rails application loaded in for your worker, you can skip that and save on memory. Another neat feature mentioned here is the ability to listen to job notifications. So this way, if a job is added to the queue, your worker can be notified instantly of it and start processing it immediately instead of waiting for the database polling. So this might play a part in choosing QClassic over some other queuing solutions. Well, there's a lot of other goodies in this documentation, so be sure to check this out for more details. So the final question is, how does QClassic stack up to the many other queuing solutions? Well, it's probably closest to Delayed Job, which is also backed by the database, but QClassic takes better advantage of Postgres' features, and it also doesn't require active record, so you can really minimize the worker process. Now as for the other options like Rescue and RabbitMQ and Beanstalk, those all require a separate daemon process to manage the queue, so if you want to keep your server setup simple, this is a great way to go. Now one thing I didn't see in QClassic is some kind of web interface like Rescue provides. If someone wants to port that over, that'd be awesome. Well, that wraps up this episode on QClassic. Thanks for watching. In the pro episode this week, I show you how to use HStore to add schemaless data to Postgres. This allows you to add persistent attributes to your model dynamically without creating database columns. To watch that episode and all other Pro and Revised episodes, just head on over to railscast.com/pro and then sign up there for just $9 per month.